The September wind of 1884 rattled the windows of a small ranch house 12 miles south of Dodge City, Kansas. Lenora Vale pulled the thin quilt around her shoulders as she perched on the edge of the narrow bed, her bare feet hovering just above the cold wooden floor. The kerosene lamp flickered on the nightstand, its flame bending and stretching with every gust that slipped through the cracks in the walls, casting uneasy shadows across the low beams overhead. Through the glass window she could see the prairie stretching on forever, a restless sea of tall grass that swayed under the crescent moon. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus, a haunting cry that made her shiver, though she could not tell whether from cold or nerves. The door creaked open and Calder Nash stepped inside. At 32, he stood tall and lean, his shoulders broad from years of ranch work. His dark hair was still damp from washing at the basin, and he had changed from the stiff suit he wore that morning at the courthouse into his everyday work shirt and dungarees. Their wedding had been brief, practical, witnessed only by Judge Whitcomb and his clerk. Lenora's heart hammered as she watched her new husband remove his boots and set them neatly by the wall. She had been warned by her friends in St. Louis that men often drank whiskey on their wedding nights to steady their nerves, and that drink made them rougher, more demanding. She had steeled herself for that possibility. Instead, Calder walked past her to the fireplace and spread a wool blanket across the wooden floor. "What are you doing?" she whispered, clutching the quilt tighter. "Making my bed," he said simply, smoothing the edges of the blanket. "You take the proper one." The words hit her like a slap. Confusion, humiliation, and a sting of rejection rose hot in her chest. "But we are married now." "Yes," he said flatly, "and as your husband, my duty is to see you safe. The bed is yours." He settled onto the floor with his back to her, using his jacket as a pillow. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room besides her own unsteady breathing. She lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling beams, waiting, hoping he might change his mind. But Calder remained still, his breathing even. Long after the embers dulled to gray, she finally drifted into uneasy sleep. When she woke at dawn, the blanket was empty. Through the window, she saw him in the corral saddling his horse. She dressed quickly, choosing a faded calico dress, and made her way to the kitchen. The house was small but solid, a main room with a hearth, table, and shelves. Calder had built himself, a loft above, and a lean-to kitchen that smelled faintly of smoke and flour. She found salt pork and flour and set about making breakfast. Cooking was one of the few skills she brought from St. Louis, where she had kept house for her father after her mother's death. Calder came in just as she was placing 2 plates on the table. He washed his hands at the basin without looking at her. "Thank you," he said simply when she set his food down. They ate in silence. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting how he cut his flapjacks into precise, equal pieces, how his large hands moved with surprising gentleness. "What would you like me to do today?" she asked softly once their plates were nearly empty. He looked up from his coffee, his gray eyes unreadable. "Whatever pleases you. Mending, tending chickens, weeding the garden. I'll be out checking the north fence, back at noon." And then he was gone. Days became routine. Calder rose before dawn, worked the livestock, repaired fences, came in for meals, and bedded down by the fire at night. Lenora tended the house, gathered eggs, weeded the garden, and tried to keep loneliness from hollowing her spirit. When Calder made his weekly trip to Dodge for supplies, he never asked if she wished to join. "Mrs. Barrow asked after you," he said one evening, setting down flour and coffee. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "That you were well," he replied, as if that closed the matter. The silence grew heavier with each passing week. Nights were worst. The Kansas wind howled through the boards, rattled the shutters, and made the loft so cold, her breath fogged in the dark. She began bringing her sewing downstairs, stitching by the fire while Calder worked at his ledger. Sometimes she caught him watching her, but whenever their eyes met, he turned away, jaw set, shoulders tense. One evening, she gathered courage. "Would you like me to read aloud?" she asked. He looked up, startled. "If it wouldn't trouble you." She opened a slim book of poems she'd carried from St. Louis and let the words of rivers, love, and loss fill the room. Calder's pen stilled, his breathing changed. Though he never lifted his eyes from the ledger, she sensed his complete attention was on her. "Thank you," he said quietly when she closed the book. "Your voice is pleasant." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given. She went to bed that night with a flicker of warmth in her chest. The next evening she waited with the book ready, but Calder lingered outside until late and went straight to his blanket. The disappointment stung more than she expected. By November, storms came. The wind screamed, snow drove against the windows, and the temperature plunged until the fire itself seemed to shrink. Calder returned from the barn one night, coated in ice, his lips blue. Lenora rushed to strip his frozen coat, pressed hot coffee into his trembling hands. "The trough's frozen solid," he muttered. "I'll need to break it again." "You can't," she insisted. "Not in this weather. The cattle need water." "And what of me?" she snapped before she could stop herself. "What of your responsibility to me? You give me shelter and food, yes, but you treat me colder than the cattle." He froze. "You knew the terms." "I thought practicality might leave room for affection," she said, voice shaking. For the first time since their wedding, grief darkened his eyes. He stood rigid by the fire. "Do you know why I cannot touch you?" "Then tell me," she demanded. And he did. A first wife named Evangeline. A marriage filled with laughter and hope. A birth that dragged on 2 days, a child too large, a wife who died in agony, a son who lived only minutes. His voice cracked as he confessed the vow he made at her deathbed. Never again to risk a woman's life because of his selfish desire. "I killed her," Calder said, eyes fixed on the flames. "My touch put her in the grave. I swore I'd never do it again." Tears blurred Lenora's vision. She stepped closer, placed her palm against his cheek. "If you want to honor her, then remember that I am alive. I chose to be here. Don't bury me with her." His eyes closed at her touch. He trembled as if standing at the edge of a river too wide to cross. "Kiss me," she whispered. "Not because duty says so, because you want to." For a long breath he fought himself, then his hands cupped her face, and months of restraint broke. His mouth crashed against hers, hungry, desperate, full of fire he could no longer deny. When they parted, both were breathless. "I'm still afraid," he whispered. "So am I," she answered. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than alone. And if you've ever been in a love where fear and desire lived side by side, let me know in the comments, because this moment right here, this confession under stormlight, was the turning point of their story. And if you're still with me, hit that like button, because we're about to see how a vow of silence can break into something far more powerful. The blizzard trapped them inside for days. Calder battled snowdrifts to keep the livestock alive. Lenora waited with hot broth and quilts, her hands steadying his. These small acts of care became their language. Their silences softened into talk, at first of weather, then of fences, then of memories. By February, Calder let her join him outside. She learned to brace posts, stretch wire, and steady herself against wind that never rested. Side by side, their words flowed easier. "Are you happy?" he asked once under a cottonwood, the cattle grazing in the distance. She thought carefully. "I wasn't before, but I am now." "I never wanted you to vanish," he said. "I wanted me to." "Then we were both foolish," she answered, and kissed him again beneath the tree. Spring thawed more than grass. Calder began to laugh. He told her stories of Evangeline without breaking apart. She shared memories of St. Louis nights after her father's death. Together they stitched past into present. One evening she told him, "I want us to be fully married." His eyes searched hers. "I've wanted that since the first day." That night fear gave way to fire, and Lenora at last felt herself not only a wife in name, but in every way. By April neighbors noticed. At church socials, Calder smiled again, and Mrs. Crowell whispered, "Marriage agrees with you, Mrs. Nash." A year later, Lenora stood at the window, watching Calder mend the expanded cattle pen. Their herd had grown, so had their love. Hattie Crowell, sipping coffee, caught her hands straying to her belly. "How do you think he'll take it?" "Terrified and delighted," Lenora said softly. At noon, Calder came in dusty and humming. He kissed her cheek as she stirred gravy. After the meal she took his hand. "I have something to tell you, Calder. I'm with child." His fork fell still. For a long moment he only breathed, then stood and crossed to the window. When he turned, his eyes shone. "I'm the luckiest man in Kansas and the most afraid." She rose, placed his hand over her stomach. We'll face both together." For the first time, he said aloud what she already knew. "I love you." And if that moment just made your heart swell, tap the subscribe button right now, because these are the kinds of stories we live for on this channel, where risk and love walk hand in hand. Years later, their porch rang with children's laughter. A boy chased a pup. A girl balanced on uncertain feet. A baby slept in a basket. Calder came up from the corral dusty to the knees, gloves tucked in his belt, the new windmill spinning steady over a herd twice the size it had been. Lenora met him on the steps with water, flour on her apron. They sat on the porch, paging through an old doctor's ledger Calder had sent for. An entry confirmed what he'd blamed himself for all these years. Evangeline's death was no one's fault. Tears slipped down his face as years of guilt lifted. "All this time," he whispered. "You were to blame," Lenora said. "Now let it go." He looked at her, at their children tumbling in the dust, at the herd grazing in peace. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I thought love was danger," he said quietly. "Turns out it was the shelter." And that, dear listeners, is the story. If you were gripped by Lenora and Calder's journey from silence to love, don't leave without giving this video a like. Tell me in the comments, what part struck you hardest? His vow of fear, her courage to demand more, or the moment he finally said the words, "I love you"? And if you're still watching, you're exactly the audience I create these stories for. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this tale with someone who needs the reminder. Yes, love is always a risk, but it's also the shelter we all need.